What is the grace of an outcast? Is it a gift given by a forgiving world, or is it something forged in the fires of that same world's cruelty? In the small, forgotten town of Stone Creek, a place caught in the amber of the late 19th century, this question was not a matter of philosophy, it was a matter of survival. And for a young woman named Ilara, it was about to become the only thing she had left. The story begins, as so many tragedies do, under the harsh, unforgiving light of a Sunday morning. The sun beat down on the dusty town square, baking the cracked earth until it was as hard and unyielding as the hearts of the people gathered there. They stood in a silent, suffocating circle, their Sunday best a stark contrast to the ugliness of their purpose. They were a congregation, yes, but their worship today was not of God, but of judgment. And at the center of it all, alone, stood Ilara. She was 19 years old, with eyes the color of a gathering storm, until this moment that had refused to be broken. Her dress was simple, a faded calico that had seen better days, but it could no longer hide the gentle, undeniable swell of her pregnancy. This child, this life growing within her, was the visible proof of her sin, the testament to the crime for which she was being tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. The air was thick with the poison of scornful whispers, a low, cruel hum that crawled over her skin. The occasional burst of mocking laughter from a group of young men was like a physical blow. This was not a private shame. It was a public spectacle, a ritual designed to carve a lesson into the memory of the town, using her heart as the slate. On the whitewashed steps of the only church in Stone Creek stood the architect of her humiliation, Elder Thornton. He was a man whose piety was as starched and rigid as his collar, the village's iron-fisted patriarch. His face was a mask of righteous fury, but beneath it, a sliver of something else flickered in his eyes, the cold, calculated satisfaction of a man cementing his own power. It was his son, Liam, who was the father of Ilara's unborn child, a truth that was the town's most poorly kept secret. With a voice that boomed across the silent square, a voice he usually reserved for sermons on fire and brimstone, he began to speak. He didn't call her by her name. He called her a stain, a blight, a disgrace upon their God-fearing community. And then, on behalf of his family and, he claimed, the entire town, he cast her out. The word struck Ilara with a physical force. A searing, white-hot pain of absolute abandonment ripped through her. This was the moment she had been dreading, the nightmare she had prayed would never come to pass. Every eye was on her, waiting. They were waiting for her to crumble, to fall to her knees in the dust and beg for a mercy she would never be given. They expected tears, hysterics, the pathetic collapse of a ruined woman. But Ilara did the unthinkable. She did nothing. A tremor ran from her, a single violent shudder, but she held her ground. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her chin. She looked out at the sea of hostile faces, meeting the gaze of her accusers, one by one. She held it, her silence a shield, a rebellion more profound and unsettling than any scream of protest could ever be. In that moment of quiet defiance, her solitary war had just begun. And you, who are listening to this story now, have you ever stood in a room or in a town square of your own making and felt the weight of 100 judgments from people who didn't know the first thing about the battles you were fighting? That feeling of being utterly alone, of your truth being silenced before you even had a chance to speak it. It's a cold, desolate place. And it was in that place that Ilara had to find the strength, not just to stand, but to eventually walk away. The dry, cracked earth beneath her feet seemed to mirror the state of her own soul, parched and starved of kindness, a symbol of the barren future they had sentenced her to. Her life had never been a gentle one. She was an orphan, raised by a grandmother whose hands were as gnarled as the roots of the wild herbs she taught Ilara to identify. Her grandmother had taught her two things of value: the resilience of the weeds that could grow in the poorest soil, and the quiet dignity of enduring hardship without complaint. She had always been an outsider in Stone Creek, a girl from the edge of the woods, never quite part of the tight-knit fabric of village life. Her past was a quiet tapestry woven with threads of loneliness and a deep, secret yearning for the one thing she had never known: the warmth and safety of a family. For a fleeting, beautiful season, she thought she had found it in Liam Thornton. Away from the suffocating shadow of his father, Liam was different. He was gentle and kind, and he spoke of a world beyond the suffocating borders of Stone Creek. He saw the wild, untamed spirit in Ilara, and for a time, he seemed to cherish it. Their courtship was a thing of secrets, of stolen moments in the twilight woods, and whispered promises under a blanket of stars. It was her only source of light, a fragile, precious hope she nurtured in the deepest parts of her heart, a tiny flower blooming in the desolate landscape of her life. When she discovered she was with child, the news was a terrifying, breathtaking joy. It was the beginning, she believed, of the family she had always craved. But a promise from a weak man is built on sand. The moment Elder Thornton discovered their secret, Liam's vows of love and a shared future crumbled into dust. His betrayal was swift and absolute. He stood by his father's side, his head bowed, a coward, cloaked in the guise of an obedient son. For Ilara, this was more than the abandonment of a lover. It was the shattering of her one and only dream. This history of loss, of being left behind, made the public shaming in the square more than just a social punishment. It was the final, devastating blow to a soul that was already intimately acquainted with grief. It was the act that would either destroy her completely or fuel a desperate, burning need to prove her worth on her own terms, to the world and to herself. Now, back in the oppressive heat of the square, that history gave her the strength to hold their gaze. She saw Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, who had once given her a warm loaf of bread just for a smile, now clutching her shawl and looking away as if Ilara carried a plague. She saw old Mr. Hemlock, who had paid her to mend his fences just a summer ago, now staring at his boots, his face a mask of grim complicity. These were not monsters. They were ordinary people, terrified of being on the wrong side of power, willing to sacrifice one of their own to maintain the fragile peace of their community. Their collective judgment was a force far more powerful and cruel than Elder Thornton alone. The sun climbed higher, a merciless white eye in a cloudless sky. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. The dust kicked up by the shuffling feet of the crowd filled her throat, and she longed for a single drop of water. The child within her, once a source of secret joy, now felt like a leaden stone, a permanent anchor to her shame. Every whisper that reached her ears, harlot, shameless, Thornton's folly, was a fresh cut. She was being unmade, disassembled piece by piece in front of them all, reduced from a person to a cautionary tale. Yet she remained standing, a solitary, unmoving figure in a world that wished she would simply vanish. Finally, Elder Thornton made a sharp, dismissive gesture with his hand, as if shooing away a stray dog. The show was over. The lesson had been taught. The crowd began to break apart, their morbid curiosity satisfied. They moved back to their Sunday dinners, and the whispers slowly fading as they put distance between themselves and the source of their discomfort. And, in the moments that followed, a silence fell over the square, a silence that was somehow heavier and more menacing than the noise had been. What would happen to her now? Where could she possibly go? The unspoken question hung in the air, a promise of the suffering that was yet to come. Then, she took a single step. the sound of her worn leather shoe scuffing against the hard-packed dirt was deafening in the quiet. Then another and another. She began to walk, not toward the main street where the shops and homes were, but toward the overgrown path that led away from the heart of the village, toward the woods. Her back was straight, her head held high. She did not look back. She was walking away from the only home she'd ever known, into an exile that had been decreed for her. Each step was an act of will, a refusal to let them see her break. She was walking toward a dilapidated, abandoned cottage at the very edge of the woods, a place of rot and ruin that was now to be her only shelter. This cottage was a physical manifestation of her new status. Its roof sagged in the middle, the porch steps were rotted through, and a broken fence leaned at a drunken angle, a pathetic barrier against a world that had already breached all her defenses. Weeds and thorny vines clawed at the walls, as if nature itself were trying to reclaim the structure. This was not a home. It was a tomb for the living, a place where a person could disappear. As she pushed open the groaning, swollen door, the smell of damp earth, decay, and forgotten things rushed out to greet her. The light inside was dim, filtered through years of grime on the single cracked window pane. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sun, tiny ghosts in the oppressive stillness. She had been cast out, abandoned, and left with nothing but the life inside her and the four crumbling walls around her. The world had declared her story over, but as the sun began to set, casting long, lonely shadows across the floor, a different truth began to settle in her heart. This was not the end. It was the beginning of a story they had never intended to be written. The first night in the cottage was a descent into a cold, profound darkness that had little to do with the setting sun. The structure was less a shelter and more a collection of gaping wounds held together by stubborn ivy. Wind whispered through the cracks in the walls, carrying the scent of damp earth and the ghosts of 100 forgotten winters. Elara sat on the floor, her back against the decaying wood, one hand resting protectively on her belly. There was no furniture, no blanket, nothing but the thin calico of her dress to ward off the encroaching chill. The silence was a living thing, broken only by the scuttling of unseen creatures in the thatch above and the frantic, terrified beating of her own heart. This was the reality of being cast out. It was not a grand, dramatic tragedy, but a slow, quiet, and deeply cold erasure. The world had not just turned its back on her, it had pushed her into a grave and was waiting for her to have the decency to lie down and be still. As the moon cast a pale, skeletal light through the grimy window, her mind, seeking any refuge, fled from the present and drifted back to another small house, one filled not with rot, but with the scent of drying herbs and wood smoke. Her grandmother's cottage. It was a place of quiet strength, a world contained within 4 small, sturdy walls. She could almost feel the rough, callous texture of her grandmother's hands, see the intricate map of wrinkles around her eyes that would soften when she smiled, a rare and precious event. Her grandmother was a woman carved from the same hard earth as the trees of the forest, and she had taught Elara the language of that world, not with gentle lessons, but with practical, unyielding instruction. This root is for fever, this leaf is for a poultice. This one, she would say, her voice as dry as autumn leaves. This one will kill a man if you are not careful. She taught Elara that the world was not kind, but it was honest. A plant would do what it was meant to do, every time. It was people who were unpredictable, their kindness a fleeting season, their cruelty a long and bitter winter. Her grandmother had never spoken of Elara's parents. They were a closed door, a silence that Elara learned early not to knock upon. She grew up with the understanding that she was a loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of Stone Creek, a wild thing from the woods that the town tolerated but never truly accepted. She was the herb-gatherer's girl, her hands perpetually stained with dirt and chlorophyll, her knowledge seen as something strange, something bordering on the uncanny. The other children would sometimes taunt her, calling her a witch's apprentice, their fear and suspicion a wall she could never seem to climb. This early solitude forged in her a deep, aching desire for connection, a yearning to be seen not as the strange girl from the woods, but simply as Elara. She dreamed of a life where she belonged, of a home filled with warmth and laughter, of a family that would be an anchor in the unsteady currents of the world. It was a simple, desperate dream, the kind that takes root in the loneliest of hearts. And then, like a sudden burst of sunlight through the dense canopy of the forest, there was Liam. He was not like the other boys in the village, who saw her with a mixture of fear and crude curiosity. He was Elder Thornton's son, destined for a life of importance, yet he sought her out in the quiet spaces at the edge of town. In the beginning she was wary, her heart a cautious, guarded thing, but Liam was patient. He asked about the herbs, not with suspicion, but with genuine interest. He spoke of books he had read, of cities far beyond the stifling horizon of Stone Creek, of a world where a person was not defined by the circumstances of their birth. He saw the fire in her, the untamed spirit that the rest of the village tried to extinguish, and he called it beautiful. Have you ever felt that? That moment when someone finally sees the person you've kept hidden away, the one you were afraid the world would crush. For Elara, it was like taking her first full breath of clean, fresh air. Their courtship was a secret world of their own making. They met in the twilight, in the hushed cathedral of the woods, where the judgments of the town could not reach them. He would bring her small, clumsy gifts, a bird's feather, a strangely shaped stone, a stolen apple from an orchard, and she, in turn, shared with him the secrets of her world, the silent language of the forest. It was in these stolen moments that she allowed herself to believe in his promises. He spoke of a future together, away from his father's iron rule, a small farm of their own where they would be free. He made her believe that the family she had always dreamed of was not just possible, but inevitable. When she realized she was with child, the fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, brilliant joy. This was it. This was the beginning. This child would be the cornerstone of the life they would build together, a life of love and belonging. The dream shattered with the force of a lightning strike. The discovery of their secret was not a quiet affair, but a brutal public unearthing. She never knew how his father found out. She only knew the terror of being summoned to the Thornton house, a place she had never dared to approach. Elder Thornton did not rage. His anger was a cold, controlled thing, far more terrifying than any shouting. He looked at her as if she were a piece of filth that had been tracked into his pristine home, and Liam, the man who had promised her a world of freedom, stood beside his father, his face pale and his eyes fixed on the floor. He did not speak, he did not defend her, he did not even look at her. In his silence, Elara heard the death of every promise he had ever made. The betrayal was so absolute, so complete, that it hollowed her out, leaving nothing but a cold, echoing emptiness where her heart had been. The public shaming in the square was merely the final ceremonial nail in a coffin that had already been built and sealed in that suffocating parlor. Now, in the derelict cottage, the full weight of that betrayal settled upon her. It was one thing to be an outcast by birth, another entirely to be made one by the deliberate cruelty of the one person she had trusted. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of survival. Hunger became a constant, dull ache in her belly. She ventured back toward the village only once, driven by a desperate need for flour or salt. As she approached the general store, she saw Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, hurry pulling her children behind her. Through the window, she saw the storekeeper, Mr. Hemlock, shake his head grimly as Elder Thornton stood in the corner, watching, his presence a silent, unyielding command. The message was clear. She was an untouchable. Her existence was to be ignored, her needs unmet. She was to be starved out, not just of food, but of all human contact. The social architecture of Stone Creek was as rigid and unforgiving as the stone that gave the town its name. Church, and at the center of the church was Elder Thornton. His power was not just spiritual, it was economic and social. He held the mortgages on half the farms in the valley. He decided who received charity from the church fund and who was deemed unworthy. To cross him was to risk not just social ostracization, but financial ruin. The people of Stone Creek were not inherently evil, but they were trapped in a system that rewarded conformity and punished compassion. To help to defy the elder, to risk their own fragile place in the community. And so they chose the path of self-preservation, hardening their hearts and turning their faces away. Their collective silence was the weapon Thornton used to enforce his decree. Elara retreated back to her crumbling sanctuary at the edge of the woods, the whispers of the townspeople following her like phantom pains. The children who once would have shyly waved now pointed and whispered, their parents' prejudice already taking root in their young minds. The broken fence around her cottage became a stark physical line between her world and theirs. On one side was the ordered, God-fearing life of the village. On the other was the wilderness, the chaos, the sin they had projected onto her. The land around the cottage was choked with thorns and weeds, the soil dry and cracked. It was a mirror of her new life, barren, harsh, and starved of nourishment. The drought that had plagued the valley to have taken up permanent residence in this small patch of forgotten earth, a perfect symbol for the drought of kindness in the hearts of her neighbors. She spent her days foraging, her grandmother's lessons now the key to her very survival. She dug for roots with her bare hands, her fingernails caked with dirt. She found berries that the birds had missed, and bitter greens that she boiled in a rusty pot she had found half buried near the cottage. Every mouthful of food was a victory, a small act of defiance against the town that wished her to disappear. But the nights were the hardest. The fear was a physical presence in the dark, a cold hand that would grip her heart and squeeze. She would lie awake, listening to the wind, her thoughts spiraling into a terrifying abyss. How would she survive the birth, alone, in this cold, rotting place? What future could she possibly offer this child, a child born into shame and exile? The weight of it all pressed down on her, and there were moments when the darkness felt absolute, when giving up seemed like the only logical choice. It was in one of these moments of deepest despair that she saw it. Pushing its way up through a crack in the warped floorboards was a single tiny green shoot. It was nothing more than a common weed, a bit of stubborn life in a place of death and decay. She watched it for days as it grew, its leaves unfurling toward the sliver of light from the dirty window. It was a small, insignificant thing, yet it held a profound lesson. It did not ask for permission to grow. It did not care that the soil was poor or the light was dim. It simply endured. It survived. Something shifted in Elara then. A spark of her grandmother's unyielding spirit flared to life within her. She was not a stain. She was not a blight. She was a weed. She would find a way to grow in the poorest soil, to survive the harshest conditions. With this newfound resolve, she began to work. Painstakingly clay from the creek cracks in the walls, silencing the constant mournful whistle of the wind. She used stones to build a crude hearth, a place to have a small, precious fire. She found a new purpose, a driving force that pushed back against the fear. She was no longer just surviving for herself. She was building a nest, however fragile, for the life growing inside her. She was preparing for a battle, not against the town, but for the future of her child. The work was exhausting, her body growing heavier and more cumbersome each day, but her spirit was slowly, painstakingly being rebuilt. She was fortifying her home and her heart at the same time. The days grew shorter, and the vibrant greens of late summer faded to the brittle golds and rusts of autumn. A new chill began to creep into the air, a damp cold that promised a brutal winter to come. The villagers began to speak of it in hushed, worried tones, noting the early migration of birds and the thickness of the squirrels' coats. They saw it as an omen, a sign of God's displeasure. For Ilara, it was a more immediate and practical threat. A harsh winter meant scarcer food, deeper cold, and a more profound isolation. She worked harder, gathering firewood until her hands were raw, drying every edible herb and root she could find, creating a small, pathetic store against the coming darkness. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows from the trees, she stood at the edge of the woods, looking back toward the distant, flickering lights of Stone Creek. The town looked so peaceful from a distance, a cozy, welcoming haven. But she knew the truth. She knew the coldness that lay beneath that warm glow. She had survived their judgment, their scorn, and their calculated cruelty. She had found a way to live on the scraps they had left her. But as she felt the first sharp bite of the coming winter on the wind, a new and unsettling question took root in her mind. She had learned to withstand the harshness of man, a force she understood. But could she possibly survive the cold, impartial cruelty of nature itself? What she didn't know, what no one in the warm, lamp-lit houses of Stone Creek knew, was that the coming winter carried with it more than just snow and ice. It was bringing a silent, creeping sickness, a shadow that no wall could keep out, a trial that would soon force the town to look into the darkness and confront the very person they had thrown into it. The first snows of winter did not arrive with the gentle, picturesque beauty of a holiday card. They came with a biting, predatory chill that seemed to seep directly into the bones. For the people of Stone Creek, it was a signal to draw their shutters tight, to stoke their fires, and to gather closer to the warmth of family and community. But for Ilara, huddled in her decaying cottage, the first delicate flakes melting on the grimy window pane were a death warrant. The forest, which had been her sparse but reliable pantry, was slowly being sealed away under a blanket of white. The roots grew harder to find, the last of the autumn berries shriveled on their branches, and the small animals she might have snared for a meager meal disappeared into their burrows. The cold was a new antagonist, one without a face or a motive, an impartial force of nature that threatened to finish the job the town had started. The thin walls of the cottage offered little more than a psychological barrier against the wind, which moaned through the cracks like a grieving spirit, a constant reminder of her profound and absolute solitude. The hunger was a living thing inside her, a dull, coiling ache that was her first thought upon waking and her last companion before a fitful sleep. It sharpened her senses, making the distant smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney an almost unbearable torment. She could picture their kitchens, the steam rising from pots of stew, the scent of baking bread, filling the warm, lamp-lit air. She survived on a thin, bitter tea brewed from pine needles and the last of her dried roots, which she would chew on for hours to trick her stomach into feeling full. Her body, already taxed by the growing life within her, began to fail her in small, terrifying ways. A dizzy spell would overtake her as she stood, her vision tunneling to a pinpoint of black. Her hands trembled with a weakness that had nothing to do with the cold the child inside her was taking. everything she had left to give, and she feared, with a cold, clear certainty, that soon there would be nothing left. Driven by a desperation that overrode her pride, she made one more attempt to appeal to the humanity of the village. Her target was the general store. Her goal, a small bag of flour, a handful of salt. Anything to turn her foraged roots into something more substantial. She waited until dusk, hoping the shadows would offer some cover, but her presence was felt the moment she stepped onto the main street. A silence fell. Doors closed softly. Faces turned away. At the store, Mr. Hemlock stood behind the counter, his face a grim, unhappy mask. Before Ilara could even speak, a voice, sharp and cold as ice, cut through the quiet. It was Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife. "We don't serve her kind here," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. She did not look at Ilara, but at Mr. Hemlock, her words a command, a reinforcement of the town's decree. Ilara saw the shadow through the elder Thornton's carriage passing by, a slow, deliberate patrol. He did not need to speak. His power was in the fear he had instilled in everyone else. To be seen helping her was to risk becoming an outcast yourself. Shamed and empty-handed, Ilara turned and walked back into the encroaching darkness, the weight of every silent judgment a physical burden on her shoulders. That night, the whispers of the town finally breached the walls of her mind and became her own. She sat in the dark, her arms wrapped around herself, and for the first time, she allowed the poison to seep in. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was a stain, a worthless, shameful thing. What kind of mother could she be, unable to even provide a scrap of bread? What future was she bringing this child into, but one of hunger, cold, and hatred? The shame was a physical sensation, a hot, crawling flush that spread from her chest to her face. It whispered that she deserved this, that her sin had been so great that this suffering was her just and righteous punishment. And isn't that the cruelest trick of shame? It convinces you that the abuse you're suffering is not only deserved, but necessary. Her grandmother's lessons of resilience felt like a distant lie, a story for a different person in a different world. In this world, the world of Stone Creek, she was exactly what they said she was. The antagonism of the village escalated from passive shunning to active cruelty. A group of boys, emboldened by their parents' rhetoric and their own youthful callousness, began to make a sport of tormenting her. They would creep to the edge of the woods and hurl stones against the side of her cottage, the sharp cracks echoing the fracturing of her own spirit. They would scrawl crude words in the dirt outside her broken fence, words like harlot and witch, leaving them for her to find in the morning light. Each stone, each word, was a fresh assault, a reminder that she was not just forgotten, but actively hated. She was their scapegoat, the repository for all the village's unspoken fears and frustrations. By punishing her, they reinforced their own righteousness. One afternoon, a rock thrown with more force than usual shattered the single grimy pane of glass in her window. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet woods. Now, even that fragile barrier was gone. The cold and the hatred of the world could come in unimpeded. With every passing day, impending reality of her grew from a distant dread into a monstrous, looming terror. Her body was a constant, aching reminder of her vulnerability. The child moved within her, a life full of innocent, unknowable promise, yet its every kick and turn sent a fresh wave of panic through her. She would lie awake in the suffocating darkness, her hands on her belly, her mind racing through a litany of horrors. What if the birth came during a blizzard? What if something went wrong? Who would help her? The image of herself, alone, bleeding and dying on the cold dirt floor, became a recurring nightmare that haunted her waking hours as much as her sleep. This fear was more profound than the hunger, more chilling than the winter wind. It was the primal terror of facing life's most elemental trial, utterly and completely alone, with no gentle hand to hold, no comforting voice to guide her through the pain. To escape the terror of the future, her mind would sometimes retreat. There was no solace, but even the memories of Liam were no longer a source of warmth, but of a bitter, burning anger. She remembered one specific evening, sitting with him by the creek as the fireflies began to rise. He had taken her hand and sworn, his voice thick with sincerity, that he would never let anything bad happen to her, that he would stand against his father, against the whole world if he had to protect her and the life they would build. He had made her believe him. The memory was now a mockery, a testament to her own foolishness. He had not stood against his father. He had stood beside him, his silence, her condemnation. The love she had felt for him had curdled into something hard and painful in her chest, a stone of resentment that she carried everywhere. His betrayal was the wound that would not heal, the source from which all her other sufferings flowed. As the winter deepened its grip on the valley, a new and unfamiliar fear began to thread its way through the village. It started as a whisper, a rumor carried on the frozen air. A child in the village had taken ill with a cough that would not quit, a fever that burned hot and fierce. Then another. It was a strange sickness, a wasting fever, the old folks called it. It seemed to defy all the usual remedies. The town physician, a man of limited skill and even more limited imagination, prescribed useless tonics and impotent prayers. Elara, on the edge of the woods, heard the news in fragments, in the worried tones of her conversation carried on the wind as people hurried past her path. She felt a distant, detached pity, but her own struggle was too immense, too immediate, to allow for much else. She had no way of knowing that this creeping illness, this shadow falling over the town that had cast her out, was a harbinger of a trial that would soon intertwine her fate with theirs in a way no one could have ever imagined. Then came the blizzard. It was not a storm, it was a siege. The sky turned flat, menacing grey, and the snow began to fall, not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding sheet. The wind howled like a wolf, piling the snow into massive drifts that buried fences and blocked doors. For 3 days, the world was reduced to a churning vortex of white. Inside the cottage, Elara fought a desperate battle for survival. The wind tore through the broken window, which she had tried to patch with rags and mud, blasting her with icy particles of snow. Her small pile of firewood dwindled at an alarming rate. She